Stablecoins and swap lines are the 1-2 punch that is going to mean that the dollar doomers, the self-loathing Americans, and the fiat fatalists are going to be wrong for years to come, and why the demise of the American empire is not as imminent as many people think. And today we're going to talk about the second part of that 1-2 punch, specifically swap lines. And the reason we're going to talk about swap lines is because I've seen so many bad takes on them over the last few weeks of what they are, what they mean, and how they work. And so what I thought we'd do today is go through exactly what that is. Now, if any of you know me, you know that I love to be on Twitter. And I saw this meme the other day, and it made me laugh so hard, and I thought it was perfect for the swap lines. And so that is really the catalyst for why I decided to talk about swap lines this week. But it's also very appropriate. And it's appropriate because they were very popular and talked about back during the global financial crisis. They were talked about a lot back in 2020 during COVID. But, I think many people kind of misunderstand what they are and how they work. And many people think it's almost just like the United States printing money out of thin air with no consequences and no collateral and no way to claw some of that money back. So what I thought we'd do today is go through exactly what they are and exactly how they work. And I put together this presentation that will kind of help us walk through it. I'm really going to go through kind of what they are, how they work, why they matter, and we'll walk through some examples of when they have been used before. But essentially, a swap line is exactly what the name implies. It is two central banks getting together and agreeing to swap currencies. But in this case, it's a US dollar swap line because it's the foreign country that needs US dollars. It is not the United States that needs the foreign currency. The United States never needs foreign currency because the dollar is the global reserve currency and it's accepted all over the world on the global stage. But in some cases, the foreign central banks need dollars because they can't create them out of thin air and their banking system needs them. And so in this case, the United States will extend a swap line and then there's a maturity, there's an interest rate associated with it. And the foreign central bank has to pledge collateral. They have to give us an equivalent amount of that foreign currency. Now, when they give us that currency, they're basically printing it out of thin air to collateralize it. And the United States is printing the dollars out of thin air to give the loan, the short-term loan, to the foreign central bank. If that loan is not returned, then the United States can take that collateral that's been pledged and sell it on the open market and get their dollars back. And doing that would push down the price of the foreign currency. So the United States is in the driver's seat on all of these swap lines. And it's kind of used as a last tool of resort, or in some cases, a short-term liquidity injection. And while it's been used fairly liberally in the past, I think this is going to be used very much as a geopolitical weapon in the years and months ahead. But let's just talk about how does this actually work? It's kind of a 5-step process. So for whatever reason, whether it's a credit contraction, some kind of a crisis, slowdown in the economy, a dollar shortage emerges on the global stage or in some foreign country's banking system. And again, the reason those foreign banks need dollars is even though they're in a foreign country, the euro dollar is the global money. So a foreign bank faces a dollar funding crunch and the local central bank cannot print dollars. So the foreign central bank requests the dollars from the Fed. The Fed will deposit dollars into the central bank's account at the Fed, and it provides, and in exchange, they pledge the collateral. The Fed delivers the dollars. It sits at the New York Fed. The foreign central bank's bank account sits at the New York Fed. That's where the interest rate is set. And those foreign central banks then use that dollar liquidity to loan out to their banking system, which needs it for their various liquidity needs. And then when the crisis subsides or the liquidity crunch is over, the dollars are repaid and the foreign currencies given back, and the whole thing unwinds. The United States gets all the dollars back and they make money on the transaction. But the key point here is that the Fed bears no currency risk because the repayment is set at the current FX rate when the swap is entered into. and they get to hold that for collateral, and they also get the the interest rate. So the number of swap lines out there, there's standing swap lines, which are permanent, and then there's temporary ones that have been granted in the past. The standing permanent swap lines were established kind of post global financial crisis, mainly when Europe was going through their kind of sovereign debt crisis. But they said at the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, Bank of Canada, and the Swiss National Bank. And when temporary ones have been added, it's banks such as Canada, Brazil, Denmark, Korea, Mexico, Norway, Sweden. But these are, China does not have one. Russia does not have one. There's a number of countries that don't have them, but these are the countries that have had them at least at some point in the past. But why do they matter? Why are swap lines needed? I mean, again, I'm kind of repeating myself, but it's because dollars are needed to operate on the global stage. And all of the world's banking system has extended US dollar credit. This is the monster euro dollar market that we've talking about for years now. And so they need dollar funding. And when that dollar funding gets squeezed, their foreign central bank cannot provide it. But the reason they matter is this euro dollar market is huge. And this euro dollar market dominates global transactions. The BIS a couple of years ago did a study and came out with the fact that there's an $80 trillion blind spot that foreign central in the euro dollar market that foreigners owe in dollars. And so it's this huge, and then that includes like offshore and shadow banking and non-bank entities. But the point, enormous demand for dollars outside the United States. Not only that, but 88% of global financial FX transaction use the dollar as one of the crosses. And then even though gold has risen as a central bank reserve in the last couple of years, from a fiat perspective, the United States dollar still far and away dominates all other fiat currencies, which about 57% of foreign central bank reserves being held in dollars. So they matter because they're kind of the lender of last resort. This is where central banks go when they have no other choice. They could also sell their US dollar assets, but this is a way to keep them from having to sell the assets. And in that sense, it protects the US economy. I mean, the last thing the United States would want is the rest of the world selling US dollar assets, which then, this is the way, though, that the euro dollar market has grown to such a size, it can pyramid back and hurt the United States. And so this is a program that the United States has put in place to help protect against these, the foreign extension of US dollar liabilities on its home market. And then this is also a way to cap borrowing costs. So because we have a global debt-based monetary system where money is loaned into existence, credit always has to be extended for the system to work. But when interest rates start to go higher, it makes it harder to extend credit, or it makes it harder for people to take on credit. And so using swap lines is a way to kind of cap those borrowing costs, bring the stress under control, get interest rates a little bit lower, and so that the system can continue functioning again. But in doing this, you got to remember, when they're extending a swap line, they're extending US dollar liquidity, which is a loan to the other central bank. Then that central bank provides funding, that dollar funding, to those banks who are in trouble or struggling because of their US dollar credit exposure. When they get this US dollar new liquidity, they're reinforcing their US dollar exposure. In other words, they are re-dollarizing. They are not de-dollarizing. De-dollarizing would be to accept the pain of that credit crunch and let the loans default and let the dollars disappear and then move on to something bigger and better. But that's not what they're doing. They don't want to deal with the pain, so they want the dollar liquidity. So they go to their central bank, and the central bank goes to the Fed. So all of this reinforces the dollar. This is the exact opposite of de-dollarization. So if we look back at the times that it's been used in the past, the global financial crisis is obviously the biggest example. At the peak in 2008, it was almost $600 billion. During the eurozone crisis, in the early teens, it was more like 100 billion, and then in COVID, it got up to about 450 billion. But during the global financial crisis, these swap lines accounted for about 25% of the Fed's balance sheet, with the ECB and the Bank of Japan being the biggest borrowers. During the Eurozone debt crisis, it wasn't nearly as big and not nearly as important, but, like 100 billion was extended. And it was first done in February and then again in May of 2010. But, these really showed up again, though, in a big way. But I should say it was subsequent to the Eurozone debt crisis that these permanent facilities got put in place, because, it had happened enough times now that they needed to have kind of an ongoing facility for these central banks to tap if and when they needed it. And the next time they really needed it was in 2020 during the COVID pandemic. And again, about 450 billion was borrowed. And again, about 80% was drawn from the ECB and the Bank of Japan. And that's also when those 9 temporary lines were put in place. But, one of the other overlooked effects of swap lines is, I kind of touched on this earlier. They're often understood as a source of emergency dollar liquidity, and that's absolutely the case. But what is less understood, at least as it used to relate to Europe, was that by providing dollars at below market rates, it also directly suppressed interest rates in these foreign money markets, because at the time, LIBOR, the London Interbank Offered Rate, was the market mechanism that set the price of borrowing money in the euro dollar market. But what happened is the way the London Interbank Offer, they would do a survey of what the lowest rate that the banks were seeing, an average of that, and that would be the rate. So by providing US dollar liquidity to the Bank of England, the Bank of England could then offer that dollar liquidity to banks at a lower rate than could fit on the open market. And so then that affected their ability to report to the LIBOR Commission what their lowest rate was. And then that allowed the LIBOR committee to set rates lower. And so this was a way for the Fed to essentially take over monetary policy at the Bank of England via the LIBOR, not at the Bank of England, via the LIBOR market, which was really the interest rate for the entire euro dollar market. So again, this is the United States setting the terms. This is not the United States being beholden to the terms. This is the United States bailing out the rest of the world and setting the terms at which the rest of the world had to play. So let's look at a couple of case studies here in more detail. So if we look at the global financial crisis in 2008, it all kind of actually started in 2007. And I don't know if many people realize this. This is a little bit of a tangent, but a lot of the people that made money in the big short trade, when they were shorting subprime, they actually made most of their money in 2007 and early 2008. By the time the depths of the crisis got around, in many cases, they had already exited those positions and that money had already been made. But anyway, that's a little bit of a side thing. This all started in 2007. The first swap lines were open to the ECB, about $20 billion and $4 billion to the Swiss National Bank, in late 2007. And then in the fall of 2008, September, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, that triggered a total run on euro dollars. And so the Fed opened the lines to the BOJ, the BOE, RBA, Riksbank, Denmark, et cetera. And when they did that in October, that was in September, but then a month later, they basically made these swap lines unlimited in size. And that was to the ECB, the Swiss National Bank, the Bank of Japan. And these secondary swap lines to places like Mexico, Brazil, Korea, and those were at about 30 billion each. And so at the peak there, it was almost $600 billion, which, as I said earlier, equated to about 25% of the Federal Reserve's assets at the time. So they weren't just buying bonds in the domestic market and increasing the size of their balance sheet. This was of them increasing the size of their balance sheet, giving liquidity to the rest of the world. Um, and so, if you added it all up, because it didn't all happen at the same time, it was over, yeah, I think like $4 trillion of total foreign liquidity that had been provided to central banks. And then all loans were eventually repaid, and the United States made about 4 billion on it. Because remember, these are loans that there's an interest rate attached, and so that was part of that. Now, let's talk Argentina. Now, if you guys remember, about 6 months ago on this program, I did an episode titled, Did the US Treasury just bail out or buy out Argentina? Because they extended them a swap line. But this was a little different. There were some strings attached to this time, and this was actually done by the Treasury instead of the Fed. And the idea that the United States just out of the goodness of their heart extended $20 billion to Argentina without getting anything out of it. Um, you know, think again. But this is the background. So basically, Javier Milei had took an office a couple years ago in 2023, and his goal was to absolutely slash inflation, which had been as high as 200%, and he wanted to restore fiscal order. And so um, the problem came was in doing that, their net international reserves fell, and they were in a deficit in mid 2025 during their midterm elections. And as they approached the midterms elections, everybody thought that his party was going to lose. And so that put even more pressure on the peso, and it came under big attack. And so it was, I think it fell 25-30% in a couple month period, which is a pretty big move, even for a currency like the Argentinian peso. So the Treasury in this case, Scott Bessent and the Treasury, not Jay Powell and the Fed, extended a swap line through the ESF, which is the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which is a Treasury function, not a Federal Reserve function. So it's not a traditional swap line, but it kind of works the same way. But essentially what they did is they extended them a $20 billion swap line to stabilize the peso ahead of the elections. And they pledged an additional like 800 million from the IMF to get it up to 20 billion. But essentially, there were some strings attached here. They made Argentina reduce its swap line with China. And 2 or 3 years ago, there was all these, dollar doomers when China extended the swap line to Argentina. They were saying this is proof of de-dollarization, and the U.S. has lost the southern hemisphere in the southern part of the Western hemisphere, and China, is the new global hegemon that is up and coming. But when the rubber really hit the road, the United States went in there, kicked out China, gave them the swap line, and not only did they help Javier stay in power, but Argentina has a lot of resources, natural resources, and as we kind of have this global power competition, natural resources are becoming more important now. Who do you think is going to get first access to those natural resources, the United States or China? Well, as a result of this, it's going to be the United States. So it wasn't a traditional fall. Like I said, I think it's a buyout. Other people call it a bailout, but the point of the geopolitical strings that came along with this swap line. But it's not just, it wasn't just an emergency measure. Again, the United States made money on this. So I'll just kind of walk you through kind of how that works. So they announced a $20 billion facility. And here's what you need to think about. People were attacking investors, bond vigilantes were attacking Argentinian financial system. But now the U.S. shows up and says, we got your back. It scares the crap out of everybody who's trying to short the peso or the Argentinian bonds. And it's kind of like if you're playing poker and the big stack at the table, you've got a decent hand, but not a great hand. And the big stack at the table pushes all his chips in. He basically makes you make a life or death decision. And when that happens, most people back off. And so that's kind of what happened here. Just the United States saying that there was a swap line in place made the market react. But essentially, they gave him a $20 billion stop line. Only $2.5 billion was actually drawn on it. And it lasted about 60 days, and then it was repaid. So I don't know exactly what the interest rate, but it was the OIS plus the spread. So let's just use, if we're just conservative, right? We're conservative. Let's say it was 5% annualized, right? So on 2.5 billion, 5% over 60 days, that's a profit of about $20 billion or $20 million, right? And so this was as a result of there's zero currency risk. $2.5 billion was deployed. It was fully repaid in 2 months, and the U.S. made I don't know 20, 30, 40 million bucks. And Scott Bessent, in his own words, said tens of millions of dollars in U.S. profit were made. And when he was testifying before Congress, subsequent to that, some of the congressmen were giving him a hard time about these bailout programs, and he pointed out that this was not just a bailout. We made money on the deal. And so that's kind of how that worked. Let's look at the UAE, because this one's really interesting as well, because this one's going on right now. This is as a result of what's going on in Iran with the blockade and the war in Iran between the United States, Israel, and Iran. So the UAE, beginning earlier this year, they obviously had some damage as a result of the war, damaging some of the energy infrastructure and the aviation infrastructure. And so their central bank governor raised the idea with Washington of having a swap line. Now, some people have said, why would they need a swap line? These guys have $285 billion in a foreign exchange reserves. They've got $1 trillion net international investment position. They've got a perfect AAA rating. And as of right now, no swap line has been extended. Discussions are ongoing. But this gets really interesting, because this is kind of a different request. They are not currently in crisis, but they are starting to have dollar funding needs. And so they could either start selling these assets, or they could get a swap line. Now, I just happened to be in Greece last week for a conference. And when I was there, I met a top executive at the Bank of Abu Dhabi, which is one of the biggest banks in the UAE. And he basically told me that, since the hostilities broke out, all transactions and all economic activity has basically come to a stop. And they are in need of global funding or dollar funding. And he says they have no need for euros. They have no need for yuan. They have no need for dirhams. They need dollars. And so this was a little bit different request, right? And it's not that they need them right now, but they can tell that they are going to need them. But the point I wanted to make here is, if a country like the UAE requests a swap line, when they could easily start selling these assets, it shows they would rather take a swap line and still be under the dollar system and be beholden to the dollar hegemony than to deal with the pain of de-dollarization, even if they have the assets to sell. If a country like the UAE, which is in a pretty good financial position, would rather deal with the pain of staying in the dollar system than deal with the pain of actual de-dollarization, selling US dollar assets and letting US dollar loans default, then what do you think the countries who aren't in such a good a position will do? And this is why it is so hard to de-dollarize. Nobody wants to deal with the pain that is necessary to de-dollarize. And that's kind of the point that I was trying to make here. If you are the UAE and you would prefer a swap line to de-dollarization, that's all you need to know. The countries would rather deal with the pain of the US dollar system than to deal with the pain of de-dollarization. And that is why, despite all the newsletters, despite all the presentations, despite all the Twitter posts and blog posts, and countless volumes that have been written about de-dollarization in the last 10 or 15 years, it's why it hasn't really happened, because nobody wants to deal with the pain. Now, what else do we want to talk about here? The other thing I want to point out is this is now a geopolitical weapon. This is used in Argentina. Strings were attached. And listen, nothing is a guarantee in this world, but I can just about guarantee that going forward, swap lines will have strings attached to them that they didn't have before. Now, if you think I'm crazy here, just imagine this. Imagine Europe now needs a swap line after they did not allow U.S. forces to use some of the military bases in their operations against Iran. In what world do you think Donald Trump and Scott Bessent and Kevin Warsh are going to provide dollars to countries that said no to the United States when the United States asked? So that's number one. The second is the China decoupling. With Argentina, they made them reduce the PBOC swap. Now, I don't know that this is going to be standard operating procedure in every new country that chooses to take a US dollar swap line or that is granted a US dollar swap line, but I would be kind of surprised if it wasn't, right? And it doesn't even have to be that. It could just be some trade alignment. You know, you have to agree to us on these trade deals or these terms of bilateral cooperation or, you know, whatever program that they're trying to get through at the time. Or they just might have to agree that they are going to pledge to use dollars for all transactions going forward. And so this idea that this is somehow a negative for the United States as opposed to a weapon that the United States can wield, I think is provably incorrect. And before the hostilities even broke out in Iran, Europe was already talking about the potential need for swap lines and the worry that with the America First policies and the fact that Donald Trump wasn't doing the things the same way that every other president had done, that they might not have access to those swap lines if and when they showed up. So the point, a long time, and they've always been political, but the way they're being used now or will be used now, I think is very different because the United States is interacting with the world on a much different level and in a much different way than it used to. And swap lines will no longer just be financial backstops. They will be leverage. And this is the point I want to make. And so somebody sent me a tweet this week and they said, well, this is just a domestic bailout. This is a way to keep foreigners from selling US dollar assets. Yeah. That's the whole point. But I don't see how this is a negative. Yeah, could foreigners sell the US dollar assets? Sure, they could. But they're not selling them because they're in good shape. They're selling them because they're in crisis. And if the US goes to them and says, hey, we can help get you out of crisis, more often than not, those foreign countries take it. It's a form of control. It's like your parents handing out allowance when you were a kid. It's a way to incentivize you, but it's also a form of control. And it works very, very well. And not only does it work well in the short term, but by keeping the dollars in the system and keeping those countries on the dollar system, it re-dollarizes the world. It does not de-dollarize the world. So it's important to understand the framing when you see these things. Everybody always tries to point, not everybody, there's the usual suspects will often try to take any headline, no matter how benign, and turn it into another failure on behalf of the United States empire. But when you actually understand how these things work, it's the United States who's in control, not the foreign adversary. Here's an example. Again, these are not domestic bailouts. You're basically locking up foreign capital. It's almost like Hotel California. And to prove this, foreign holdings of U.S. treasuries, even though gold has risen, is at an all-time high. And the net international investment position of the United States is at an all-time low. That chart on the right is proof of the milkshake. That is the United States sucking up capital from all over the world. And it is proof that the rest of the world wants to own US dollar assets. If they had been selling US dollar assets and leaving the dollar and leaving the United States, this chart would be going the other way. But ever since 2018, when I first started talking about this milkshake, the usual suspects said, oh, this isn't going to last. This isn't going to last. This isn't going to last. Well, you know what? It's more than doubled since that time. So, foreigners have $9 trillion worth of treasury holdings, the all-time high. They've got there's a $27.5 trillion net investment position, and there's $35 trillion of total holdings of U.S. securities that the world could sell if they wanted to. But rather than sell, they choose to take swap lines. Again, it doesn't mean that selling won't take place. And it doesn't mean that if and when a crisis happens, foreigners won't sell US dollar assets. Of course they will. They don't have a choice. But they can also offset some of those sales by using US dollar swap lines, which locks that money into the United States rather than having it all get sold. And so, again, they wouldn't be selling those assets if they themselves were not in trouble. If they were going to sell those when things weren't bad, they would already be doing it. And the chart on the right proves that they're not. So again, when you hear these things, just make sure you understand the framing and what's actually going on. So, I've talked at the very beginning, I talked about this 1-2 punch. No other country has the 1-2 punch that the United States has. They're going to dollarize the world via individuals with stable coins. They're going to put dollars in every pocket of citizens around the world who want to hold a US dollar balance rather than holding their local currencies. And there's an incredible demand out there without the Fed getting involved. This is a way without the Fed that the citizen that's in Timbuktu or South Africa or Sri Lanka or Russia or Canada or Australia or Thailand can hold a US dollar balance rather than holding their local currency. This is dollarization from below. This is the grounds up dollarization of the world. And from the top down, that's the swap line. That's where you get dollars in every vault. You get leverage with the conditions and you get re-dollarization rather than de-dollarization. And this is why all of the spilled ink on de-dollarization and the fall of fiat and the death of the dollar are completely wrong. Write it down. Okay. So what are the key takeaways? Long story short, it's a global safety net. It's a way to get liquidity to those who need it and keep them on the dollar system. It's been proven in 3 crises. There's 3 times where the world could have moved on to a different system, and instead they re-dollarized. There's evolving use cases, increasingly using strings attached as geopolitical leverage, and it puts dollar dominance right back at the center and makes the dollar more dominant than ever. So, it's not that countries won't continue to try to de-dollarize, and it's not that there's not a desire for de-dollarization, but the swap lines and the stable coins are going to make it more difficult than ever to actually do it. Okay, so what does all this mean? Why does this even matter? Why even talk about this? Well, the reason it's important to talk about it is because it doesn't mean that you need to rush out and necessarily do anything. It's important to understand it though. And it means you don't have to necessarily worry your eyes out every time somebody writes another de-dollarization piece. It means you don't have to freak out every time somebody says that China is now going to extend, some kind of a new monetary system that's going to overtake the dollar. It means all of the newsletters speaking of US dollar hyperinflation are nonsense. And it means that this crisis that may eventually come, maybe it will, I don't know, maybe it will, is probably going to be more of a re-dollarization effort than a de-dollarization effort. So what does that mean? It means that things are very uncertain in the world. And it doesn't mean that things are all good. But in times of great uncertainty, what's the one thing you should probably own? Gold, right? Now, I don't necessarily think that gold is going to have a year this year like it had last year, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't own it. Everybody should own it. And for the gold that, that you have that's sitting there, if you're looking for different ways to put it to work, there is a way you can put it to work without it just sitting in a vault doing nothing. And that is you can actually earn a yield on gold. And if you believe gold is money, Monetary Metals is a company that's actually proving you right. They're actually putting money to work in the real world, and they're allowing you to get paid to do it. Now, you don't take your whole stack that you've been saving up for a rainy day and put it all into Monetary Metals. But if you have a large allocation to gold, there is nothing wrong with taking a portion of that allocation and putting it to work and getting paid interest to do it. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, I would encourage you to go to monetary-metals.com/Santiago, and you can learn all about it. And if you have any questions for me, you can send me an email and I can make an introduction for you there as well. And finally, if you liked about what we talked here, we always are writing and talking about this kind of stuff. And if you go to research.santiagocapital.com, you can find out more information there. In any case, I appreciate everybody tuning in. We'll be back again next week. And in the meantime, everybody stay safe.